The streets were still, the sun low, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. A breeze rolled through town like memory, lifting the dust without direction. Inside the local gun store, everything was ordinary, wood-paneled. Walls, lined rifles, quiet conversation, and a sense of routine so familiar that no one expected it to shift, but it did. Without warning, without sound. A man entered, and the air changed, not suddenly, not obviously, but like a pressure. Drop before a storm. He didn't move like the others. His steps were slow, not from weakness, but precision. The way someone walks when they've marched through heat, fear, and fire, and come back with a silence that says more than words. No one knew him. No. One thought they needed to. He was older, weathered, quiet. Worn boots, a faded jacket, steady eyes. The kind of presence that asks for nothing but commands everything. And yet, behind the counter, respect was absent. A smirk, a careless remark. A laugh passed between young men who saw only age and forgot to look deeper. That laugh echoed too far. And while he left without a word, the clock began. Not for revenge, not for show, but for memory, for discipline, for something that doesn't announce itself but never forgets. 45 minutes, 5 vehicles, a silent presence that would turn a routine afternoon into something unforgettable, not with force, but with quiet precision. And in that silence, the town would learn what kind of man they had just dismissed, and what kind of men were still willing to stand behind him. It began with the sound of an old bell above the door, the kind that rings sharp and sudden in a place frozen in time. The gun store was small, tucked into the side of a 2-lane road in a town where everyone thought they knew each other. Inside, the walls were lined with rifles. The air carried the familiar tang of oil and spent powder, and a dusty American flag drooped from a corner like a relic of better days. The kind of place where stories hang in silence and pride is measured in hunting trophies, not words. When he stepped through that door, the room didn't go silent, but the energy shifted. Not everyone noticed. Some didn't care. But a few glanced up and felt it in their bones. Something about the way he moved, slow, steady, deliberate. He wasn't frail, but he didn't move quickly either. He walked like every step was calculated, not out of weakness, but because he had nothing to prove. The kind of walk that came from years of knowing that speed means nothing without purpose. His boots were worn smooth, the kind only a soldier would keep after retirement. His jeans hung loose, comfortable, but with weight. Over his frame, a faded camouflage jacket hugged his shoulders like armor he'd never taken off. No logos, no patches, just age and dust and memory. On his head, a dark blue cap sat low over his brow, the spot where a seal insignia once rested now faded beyond recognition. His face was lined with years, not just time, the kind of lines that only form in sandstorms, over open sights, and inside moments most men wouldn't survive. His eyes told the real story, clear, calm, alert. The eyes of a man who had seen death often enough to stop fearing it, but never enough to forget that his name was Thomas Hawkins. Hawk, they used to call him, once a SEAL commander, once the man others followed without question. Now just another quiet old man who lived near the edge of the forest a few miles outside town. People whispered stories about him, but he never confirmed anything. He never needed to. The kind of man who lets others talk and just keeps walking. Hadn't come to the store in a while. He didn't need to. Most of what he needed, he already had. But sometimes he came, and when he did, he never stayed long. He didn't browse. He didn't talk. He came with purpose, did what he needed, and left. That day was no different, or so it seemed. But inside the store, something had changed. The faces were younger, less familiar. New employees, men with tight shirts, fresh fades, and arrogance sharper than any blade in the room. They saw him come in and didn't recognize the weight he carried. They saw gray hair and slow steps and assumed weakness. They saw silence and mistook it for submission. He didn't speak. He simply made his way to the counter, eyes scanning the shelves. He stood still, hands at his sides, waiting. There was no hurry in him, no tension. Just that steady, almost serene calm that unsettles anyone who doesn't understand it. The clerks behind the counter exchanged glances. One of them smirked. Another let out a quiet laugh, the kind you hear in locker rooms and never in battlefields. They didn't know what they were looking at. And that was the problem. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no threats. Just a subtle shift in tone, a dismissive glance, a comment thrown casually, like a stone into still water. They didn't want to help him. Maybe they thought he didn't belong. Maybe they thought they were funny. Maybe they were just too young to know what respect looked like. He didn't react. Not visibly, not outwardly. But something changed in the room when he turned and walked out. A quiet tension lingered, like the air just before a thunderstorm. Those inside the store went back to whatever they were doing. Jokes resumed. Laughter returned. But outside, the old man kept walking, his boots crunching over gravel, his steps measured as ever. He reached his truck, a beat-up, reliable thing that had probably seen more mileage than any of them would in their lifetimes. He opened the door slowly, climbed in without hurry, and reached across to the glove compartment. Inside was a phone, an old flip model, scratched, dusty, barely holding a charge. It didn't need apps or signal bars. It only needed one number. He flipped it open and pressed a single key. There was no hello, no explanation. He simply spoke, calmly, like a man placing an order at a diner. Then he closed the phone and stared through the windshield for a long moment. The sun was high, the sky empty, the heat rising off the pavement in shimmering waves. He didn't look back toward the store. He didn't need to. He started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life, as steady and stubborn as its driver. And with one turn of the wheel, he pulled onto the road and disappeared into the distance. Behind him, the gun store returned to its rhythm, unaware that the countdown had already begun. In 45 minutes, the block would look very different, because some men don't raise their voices. They make a call, and the world listens. Before he was the old man walking out of a gun store in silence, Thomas Hawkins had been something else entirely. Years ago, before the gray hair and the weathered skin, he was a ghost in the desert, a commander whose presence never needed announcement. Back then, his name was spoken only in tight circles, in briefing rooms and satellite calls, whispered by men whose lives depended on his decisions. And every time he moved, others followed. He was born for the battlefield. Not because he loved war, but because he understood it. He understood how to navigate chaos, how to bring calm into storms. His leadership was quiet, exact, unshakable. Men trusted him not because he shouted, but because when bullets started flying, his voice was the one they listened for. In his world, hesitation was death, and he never hesitated. Not once. In the early 2000s, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, he led a mission that should have ended in a grave. They were deep behind enemy lines, outnumbered, radio contact lost, extraction hours away. The temperature had dropped below freezing, the terrain was hostile, and the enemy had eyes everywhere. They moved through the dark like shadows, keeping low, conserving every ounce of energy. One man was wounded. Another was falling apart inside. Hawkins didn't panic. He didn't change tone. He adjusted. He adapted. He split the team without hesitation, sent two ahead, stayed behind with the wounded, and waited. For 10 hours he held position. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink. He kept that soldier alive, kept the perimeter clear, and when help finally came, every man was accounted for. No fanfare. No medals that day. Just a dusty ride back to the base and a silent nod from the only man above him in command. That was the kind of warrior he was. Efficient, unseen, dependable. The man who never sought the spotlight, only the safety of his unit. He served for nearly 30 years across continents and cultures, earning every scar and every wrinkle on his skin the hard way. And when he finally left, not because he wanted to, but because his body whispered what his pride never would. He didn't hold press conferences or farewell parties. He packed a single bag, turned in his final report, and disappeared into civilian life like smoke into the air. But peace was never his environment. It's hard for a man trained for combat to adjust to the quiet. Supermarkets felt like ambush sites. Crowds were unpredictable. Loud noises brought him back to places his mind didn't want to visit. So he moved where there was space. A Bahaha. Cabin near the tree line, far from traffic, far from noise, far from questions. He built a small life with his hands, chopping wood, raising 2 dogs, fixing old gear not because he needed it, but because working with his hands was the only thing that quieted the voices of memory. He didn't ask for pity. He never joined veteran groups or spoke at local events. Not because he wasn't proud, but because real pride doesn't need an audience. His medals remained boxed, tucked away in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. His uniform hung in the back of a closet, untouched, folded so precisely that it might as well have been waiting for orders. And in a shoebox, near a shelf of dusty books, lay the names of men who never came back. Brothers in arms. Men he still heard in dreams. Some he saved. Some he couldn't. Each name a scar deeper than any wound. The townspeople didn't know all that. They only saw the quiet man at the edge of town. The one who nodded politely but never stayed long. They saw the age but not the history. The slowness but not the discipline. What they missed was the fire still in his blood, the precision still in his posture, the weight he carried in silence. That gun store didn't know either. They saw a customer. He had once been a weapon dot, and in that moment, when he walked out and made that call, he wasn't looking for revenge. That wasn't his nature. It was about something else entirely. About respect, about memory, about not letting time erase what mattered. That day in the store was just another mission. Not about bullets or violence. It was about reminding the world that dignity doesn't retire with the uniform. When he drove back down that gravel road, he wasn't thinking about the clerk's laugh or the smirk behind the counter. He was thinking of his unit, of a dozen men, scattered across the country, living civilian lives, raising families, working jobs, but still bound by one thing, a bond that didn't fade. The kind of loyalty forged in blood, silence, and shared survival. And when they saw that number light up on their phones, they knew what it meant. They didn't ask. They didn't need details, because when Hawk called, they came. 45 minutes isn't much time. In most lives, it passes without notice. A lunch break, a drive across town, a nap that feels too short. But in the world Thomas Hawkins came from, 45 minutes could be the difference between life and death. It was enough time to set a perimeter, reposition snipers, plan an extraction, disappear from satellite range. And on that quiet street outside the gun store, 45 minutes was all it took to change everything. The first SUV rolled in without sound, matte black, windows tinted, engine so smooth it felt like it hovered. Then came the second, and a third. By the fifth, the rhythm became unmistakable. They didn't park directly in front of the store, they surrounded it. One vehicle. At each corner of the block, like chess pieces locking down a target. No rush, no screeching tires. Just movement with precision and purpose. Doors opened in sync. Men stepped out, not loud, not flashy. There were no uniforms, no visible weapons, no barking orders. But anyone watching would have felt it instantly. The shift in pressure, like the air had thickened. They wore jeans, boots, neutral jackets, but their posture betrayed them. Straight backs, eyes scanning, movements tight. These weren't civilians. They were men trained to end chaos before it began. Each one walked slowly toward the store, not in formation, not as a threat, but as a reminder. They moved like wolves returning to a place where one of their own had been disrespected. Calm, controlled, unapologetic. Inside the store, the laughter had faded. Something about the atmosphere shifted even before the first doorbell rang. The clerks noticed. Customers began to feel it too, that inexplicable sense that something serious was about to happen. Not dangerous, just different. They didn't storm the building. They entered one by one. No words. Just presence. Each man looked around briefly, then posted himself silently near a wall or shelf. One adjusted a display of ammunition. Another examined a scope. Another simply leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the young clerk who'd made the mistake. But it wasn't intimidation. That would have been too easy. It was something deeper. The kind of silence that says, "You were out of line, and now you know it." The clerk, suddenly unsure of himself, avoided their eyes. The smirk that had come so easily earlier now vanished. Behind the register, the other employees stood still, not understanding what they were witnessing, only that they wanted no part of it. No violence, no confrontation, just stillness, just gravity. The leader among them, though no one would have pointed him out directly, was the man who placed something small on the counter. A box, ordinary in appearance, unlabeled. Inside, .308 match-grade rounds, the exact kind Hawkins had come for. He didn't say where it came from. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Payment had already been made in ways none of those clerks could ever understand. One of the veterans casually placed a sticker on the glass, a trident symbol, old, faded, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. No explanation. Just left there, a quiet brand burned into the shop's memory. Then, one by one, they walked out. Not in unison, not in a show. Just as silently as they'd arrived. No one spoke. No one needed to. Within minutes, the SUVs were rolling again, turning corners and disappearing down quiet streets. Like fog at dawn, present then gone. But the air in the store didn't clear, not right away. What lingered wasn't fear, it was recognition. A dawning awareness of something that couldn't be Googled, couldn't be faked. A reminder that strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it walks with quiet confidence. And when called upon, it answers without hesitation. Clerk didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't look at anyone. He stared at the counter, at the spot where the box had been. There was no label, no receipt, just silence. In the parking lot, after the last vehicle turned the corner, Thomas Hawkins returned, alone, as quietly as he had left. He didn't enter the store again. He didn't need to. From the edge of the sidewalk, he looked through the glass. The clerk saw him. Their eyes met. No anger, no pride, just understanding. Hawk nodded once. Then he turned, stepped back into his truck, and drove away. Long after the SUVs vanished and the silence returned to that quiet block, something lingered. Not fear, not tension, but reflection. The kind that settles slowly, like dusk over a battlefield after the smoke clears. Inside the gun store, the staff resumed their work, but nothing felt quite the same. The laughter didn't come back. The confidence had shrunk into something smaller. No one spoke of what happened aloud, but the memory pulsed in the background like a low-frequency hum. Everyone felt it. For the clerk who started it all, the weight was heavier. He moved slower now, not physically, but mentally. There was a change in the way he handled the ammunition, how he cleaned the glass counters, how he looked at the front door every time it opened. He wasn't afraid of another visit. What haunted him was the quiet realization that he'd missed something sacred, that he'd failed to recognize honor in its most silent form. The memory of those men, calm, organized, respectful, carved itself into his perception of strength. No shouting, no threats, just presence. Across town, in the cabin nestled between pine and silence, Thomas Hawkins sat on the back steps. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, he didn't dwell on the events of the day. That wasn't his nature. Reflection for him wasn't nostalgia, it was calibration. He thought not of the insult, but of the precision with which his brothers had responded. The unity, the understanding that didn't require a single word. That was what mattered. It reminded him of everything the world often forgets. That discipline outlives duty. That service doesn't end with a folded flag or a retirement pin. That the bond between warriors doesn't fade, it evolves. And sometimes it rises when least expected, not for revenge, not for show, but to restore something quietly sacred, dignity. The men who came that day didn't do it for Hawkins. They did it for what he represented, for every man whose service is ignored, whose medals gather dust, whose silence is mistaken for weakness. Their presence was a message. You don't erase valor with time. You don't mock what you never had the strength to understand. Hawkins knew they would come, not because he asked, but because he would have done the same. Because when you spend your life side by side with men in war, you don't unlearn that. Loyalty and peace, you carry it, like weight in the soul, like echoes that never fade. The dogs barked once, then settled. The wind moved through the trees with a whisper, and the fading light turned the world gold. Hawkins breathed in the air, dry, pine-sweet, filled with the kind of quiet that most people never learn to appreciate. He wasn't proud. He wasn't satisfied. He was simply resolved. And far from his porch, unknowingly changed, the clerk stayed late that night. He didn't tell anyone why, but he cleaned the shop more thoroughly than usual. He moved the trident sticker to a higher spot on the glass, not because someone told him to, but because some part of him understood now. Understood that some symbols didn't belong at eye level. They belonged where you had to look up to see them. He pulled out his phone and began searching things he'd never bothered with before: SEAL insignias, deployments in Afghanistan, meanings behind medals he used to roll his eyes at. And slowly, the fragments formed a picture. Not of Hawkins exactly, but of what he'd been part of. And that picture, quiet, dignified, eternal, became something the clerk didn't expect. A source of regret and then respect. In the following days, something shifted. Customers noticed a difference in tone. The jokes were fewer, the eyes sharper, the service more measured. No one mentioned the SUVs. No one had to. Their absence was louder than their arrival. At the edge of the forest, Hawkins returned to his routine. He split wood, repaired a section of fencing, made coffee as he always did, precisely, methodically, without waste. The only sign that anything had happened was a new mark on the stock of an old rifle in his shed. Just a line, no name, no date. Just a reminder. He hadn't expected anything from that day. No apology. No recognition. He didn't seek justice, only to protect something fragile in a world too loud to hear it. The unspoken code between those who serve and the respect owed to them long after their last mission. And though no one ever called him a hero to his face, though the store never issued a statement or made a post, he didn't need that. Men like Hawkins never needed a stage. They just needed space to walk in peace. That was the lesson. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't go viral. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that stays. Time passed and life returned to its usual rhythm. Cars came and went. The gun store opened every morning, and the town continued its quiet march forward, unaware that it had witnessed something worth remembering. But for those who had felt it, those who had seen it, the moment stayed. Not loud, not dramatic, just lodged in the back of the mind like the echo of a distant explosion, still resonating even after the smoke had cleared. The sticker remained on the shop window, faded now by sun and dust but untouched. No one dared remove it. No one even spoke of it. It wasn't decoration. It was a marker, a reminder, a warning. It had become part of the store, not just stuck on the glass, but burned into the consciousness of everyone who worked there. Customers would sometimes pause at it, trying to make out the shape. Some recognized it. Most didn't, but they felt something, a subtle weight. Like walking past a memorial without realizing it. The clerk never repeated his mistake. Not because someone forced him to change, but because that day had altered his measure of what mattered. He didn't fear men like Hawkins anymore. He respected them. Respected their silence, their calm, their history. He began to see them everywhere, not physically, but in gestures and expressions, in quiet nods exchanged between older men passing each other on the street. He began to understand the language of service. Not spoken, but lived. Hawkins never returned to the store. He didn't need to. His presence had been enough. His brothers had spoken for him in the only way that mattered, through discipline, unity, and unmistakable weight. What was said in silence had echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. And in that echo, something permanent had settled. At home, Hawkins continued to live as he always had. Days passed in quiet labor. He repaired old tools, replaced a rotting fence post, cleaned his rifle one slow, deliberate motion at a time. He fed the dogs, walked the edge of his land, chopped wood with the same rhythm he'd used on deployment, not out of necessity, but because purpose was survival. The routine wasn't routine for him. It was the structure that kept memory from spilling over. He didn't talk about that day. Not even with those who came. They didn't need to. Each man who had arrived knew what it meant. Their part had been played, their presence delivered, and nothing more was required. There were no follow-up calls, no planning meetings, no stories passed around in bars. Just one day, one response, and the quiet continuation of life. That was their way. The mission had ended the moment Hawk nodded at the glass and drove off. And in the greater sense, that was the story. Not the moment in the store. Not the arrival of black SUVs. Not the sudden shift in atmosphere. The story was what remained after all that. What stayed in the quiet. What endured long after the eyes had turned away. It was in the way the clerk looked at veterans now, not as relics, but as men still walking with purpose. It was in the way the town, without knowing why, had begun to speak a little softer around the old ones, had begun to listen more closely when a story was told by someone with lines around the eyes and scars on the hands. It was in the silence between old friends meeting again, not with noise or embrace, but with a single glance that said everything. It was in the way Hawkins added one more name to his list that night, not because someone had died, but because someone had remembered, and that was all he had ever wanted. Not glory, not revenge, just remembrance. Just a small acknowledgement that the weight carried by those who served still mattered. That the things they gave up, the nights, the sleep, the limbs, the peace, had not vanished into the noise of the modern world. That something sacred remained. He didn't expect a parade. He didn't want a medal. He didn't need applause. Men like him didn't chase noise, they carried the burden. Quietly, completely, permanently. And the next time someone new stepped into that store and asked about the trident on the window, no one gave a full answer. They didn't need to. They just said, "It's best you know how to treat people, especially the quiet ones." Because that's what stayed, not the story, but the lesson. Some stories don't need explosions or gunfire to leave an impact. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the ones carried in silence and scars and the loyalty that never asks for recognition. What happened that day in a small-town gun store wasn't just about a man being disrespected. It was about what he stood for, what every veteran stands for: dignity, brotherhood, memory. You never know who you're standing in front of. You never know what they've done, what they've carried, what they've given up. So next time, before you judge, before you laugh, before you look down on someone who walks slower or speaks less, remember this story, because respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn and something you owe. And if this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that honor the quiet warriors among us, the ones whose missions never really end.